Welcome to Holy Kool-Aid Live. I am joined today by none other than the famous, some would call him infamous, Aron Ra. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with Aron's channel. If you're not already, you can find it on YouTube, and he dives into a wide array of topics. He explores abiogenesis, evolution, phylogeny. He's been a major proponent in the fight against creationism, young Earth creationism, the crazy madness and pseudoscience that lies therein. And I'm delighted to have a conversation with him about this topic. It's a topic I've been interested in for years. So, Aron, welcome to the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. You'll probably hear my parrot screaming my name in the background. There's nothing that can be done about him. If I put him in the backyard, because I've got a cage, I can put him in the backyard, but he just screams louder, and then it disrupts the whole neighborhood.
I see.
Yeah, so sorry about that.
Only a matter of time before parrots evolve to talk with us, right? Or is that how evolution works?
No, I don't see that happening. Well, there are a couple that can, and mine is that in that range that it can. I like to hypothesize about raccoons being the next sentient species to go rummaging through the rubble of our civilization and eventually piece together that there was a previous civilization. And I hope that the raccoons will eventually figure out that it was religion that killed us.
That's like I can hear it already. Kind of like Guardians of the Galaxy. But I wanted to dive in real quick. Normally, what I do in these conversations is I chat for about 20 minutes or so with my guests one-on-one. We dive into a particular topic, and then we open it up for my patrons to join in the conversation, kind of as an added perk. So for any of you who have questions, you can do super chats. We'll get to all the super chats. And for anyone who wants to join the chat later, just click on, there should be a link in the description to become a patron. But Aron, for now, doing a series, a systematic classification of life with the millions and millions of life forms that are currently on this planet, not to mention all the ones that have gone extinct. Is that not biting off a little more than one person alone can chew?
Well, it's not me alone. I actually have a team of people that are volunteering on this and have been for a couple of years now. We've had a couple of database engineers have invested tens of thousands of British pounds into this project. And I did the video series, Systematic Classification of Life, for two reasons. One, to give people an idea of what was in the works, so to speak, behind the scenes, because we can't unveil it yet. We're hoping to do so in September. And also because the way that I met my wife was she was originally an old Earth creationist. And I met her on Christian forums, and the way that I won her over was by going through each of the different clades and getting her to admit that, yeah, she belongs to each of these classifications, each of these categories. And that was the way that kind of opened the door to science for her. Because not everybody believes for dishonest reasons. I believe that there's a whole lot of the creationist movement are willfully, deliberately dishonest. And a whole lot more just illogical. But there's a lot of other people who are sane, rational people that just don't know any better. So very often these people will encounter reason and actually accept it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. For some reason, I'm getting a little bit of lag. I'm not sure if you're getting that, but I think a few of the people in the chat are seeing that. I apologize to anyone who's getting lag, but yeah, that's one thing I've definitely noticed is I used to be a young Earth creationist myself, and it was by kind of walking through the different steps to figure out, where did we come from? How did this all, come about from nothing? Realizing what we already know, that I started to kind of figure it out and realize that, hey, maybe there's something to this. It's not just a bunch of crazy scientists who are in some grand conspiracy to pull the wool over our eyes. And in this process, I didn't realize until I started watching your series that just how many different clades there are. How many, it's not the traditional, you have like kingdom and phylum and class and whatnot. What was the Carl Linnaeus who initially put forth those kind of simplistic classifications? And yet that's you'll have to correct me, but it sounds like that's no longer accepted at all within the scientific community, correct?
The Linnaean system was, it's an interesting construct because Carolus Linnaeus was himself technically a creationist. He was a Christian living 100 years before Darwin. He lived in a time when species were considered to be immutable. And so now people had derived different subspecies or breeds, but nobody had ever seen speciation. So they said it was impossible. And so if speciation is impossible, then when he tried to classify all organisms, all plants, all animals that they were known at that time, he rather quickly discovered, as you can see with the tree that he made, that there is a branching tree pattern, and it was inconsistent with creationism. I mean, why would God create things in nested hierarchies to other things that were already created? That made no sense. And so he challenged the scientific community to please explain this. And of course, nobody could. And the direct part of his challenge was when he said that he realized that either humans are apes or apes are humans. And so he he classified chimpanzees and orangutans as humans. And, there was Homo troglodytes and Homo nocturlensis, which is now the classification for vampire, according to some movies. But anyway, what happened was the scientific community's response to that was that they couldn't respond to that without violating their own religious beliefs. So they arbitrarily contrived an artificial clade called Pongo, in which they put all of the non-human apes so that they could keep apes and humans in separate boxes. But then about 30 years ago, we finally get enough of the genome compacted that we realize that humans are apes, that we are in fact in the same box. And so the construct has changed so that Pongo still exists, but it's now reserved for orangutans and a handful of Indian or Asian variations of that, like Civipithecus, Gigantopithecus, and so forth, Ramapithecus, and so on. And then there's another one on the hominine side. Then we have the gorillas and the chimpanzees, which are much closer to us, and of course, us.
So how do you, when you're trying to classify, let's say that there's a species and you're like, I have no idea where to put this. How much of it is determined by genome sequencing? How much of it is based off of like morphology? Like, how do you figure out where to correctly classify something, especially if it's based off of fossils that of animals that we don't have any kind of genes for or any way to sequence it? Like, how do you determine where to put these things?
Well, with vertebrate paleontology, that's usually pretty easy because things like pterosaurs, for example. What I did was I ended up talking to the experts in the field. I mean, yesterday, in fact, I interviewed Aron Ra I. She's one of the foremost experts on pterosaurs, and I talked with a couple of his associates who also do cladistics on pterosaurs. So these are the names that always come up when you're studying pterosaurs. So I go to those experts. They do have, I think, two trees that they tend to argue about, and there's not much that can be done to resolve them except by popular vote on the experts as to morphology, because that's all we have. There are no surviving pterosaurs, so we have no genes to follow this up. The beauty about phylogenetics, which has replaced Linnaean taxonomy and is based on evolution, it's based on the evolutionary phylogeny. It's now twin nested. So we start with the original classification of doing things by the morphology, the physical characteristics. But there are some mistakes that can be made and have been made in so doing. Like one, for example, it was believed that pangolins, anteaters, and aardvarks had all lost their teeth. And so it was decided that these are all anteaters. They all eat ants. They have all lost their teeth. So it must be a convergent thing. So they had a common ancestor, loss of teeth, and led to these three. But the genetics shows that, in fact, all three of these lost their teeth individually, not having a direct relationship. Aardvarks are actually closer related to elephants, and pangolins are somehow closer related to carnivores, even though they don't have any teeth. And then you have the actual anteater, and all three of these are different lineages. And there's some other interesting background stories like that too. My favorite of all of these was one that I happened across a couple months back when I was doing Deuterostomes, and for every one of my videos, I have to make sure, because we've only got a team of volunteers, I have to go through and make sure that everything that I'm about to show in the video is as it is supposed to be. So I have to check everybody's work before I take a screenshot of it. I have to make sure that it's all right. And I found one that seemed grossly out of place. It was declared to be the oldest Deuterostome, and worse, it was said to be the ancestor of all other Deuterostomes. just because it was a whole bunch older than I thought it could be or should be. So I started looking at this thing and trying to figure out if this classification is correct, because I often have to do that. I found a couple of things that were classified by having only trace fossils, like fin impressions or footprints, and I just removed those. If we don't have anything more physical than a footprint, I don't think we can classify an animal by a fin impression about, you know, what species of fish that is. So I eliminated those, and I make notations in my system when I do that. So I found this one thing, and what they are is they're only about a millimeter long. It's just basically, it's like a little sac or a ball that has some little indescribable nodes on it, and what looks like a large mouth with no anus. Now, Deuterostomes are a subset of nephrozoans. Nephrozoans are classified by having the characteristic of having a through gut with a mouth on one side, an anus on the other, and they have the through gut, and then you know what? I'm getting confused as to which is which. Deuterostome is a subset of nephrozoans, so they're classified by just this all the way through internal digestive tract. And here's the thing that they said that they can't find an anus on this thing. And so remember, it's only a millimeter long. It's microfossil, and they found a handful of them. But there's only one person that's ever studied these. So I try to contact this guy to say, how do you justify having something that doesn't have an anus classified in a category of things that, you know, are identified by the fact that they have an anus and a through gut and all? It just makes no sense. How did you justify this? And it turns out that the guy that had studied that was not going to respond to me because he's a hardcore religionist. And the one paleontologist, and he's an eminent paleontologist too, with a great deal of past knowledge or you know, past experience and so forth. So he's looked up to in the field, even though he's made some very sketchy comments, like that he wants to assert that humans were inevitable. That if you went back in time, as Gould said, and you changed something in the past, that that the same things would still evolve, or that ultimately we would still end up with people. Even if we don't look quite like people, we would still be people. We'd still be, you know, 2 legs, 2 arms, you know, a head. We would still like. He had no more vision for how different aliens could look than the creators of Star Trek. I mean, so that all aliens are going to look pretty much the same.
Wrinkly foreheads.
Yeah, green skin, pointed ears, something like that. But no, you're basically people, you know.
Yeah.
And even if they started from dinosaur stock, they would still look like people, essentially. So like the Gorn, again, in Star Trek. So this is the way that this guy is thinking, and it's entirely for religious reasons. He wants to believe that everything is you know, predetermined to be this way. So he found something that didn't fit in the taxonomy anywhere else, and should have you know, been accordant to that. But he insisted on sticking it in a clade that already existed, rather than allowing that other clades could have existed that have since gone completely extinct for no reason at all. And we now know that, you know, you often hear creationists argue that all of the major phyla were created in the Cambrian explosion. We now know that there was a couple of major phyla that were already extinct before the Cambrian explosion began, and another one that didn't exist yet, you know, didn't show up for a little while later. And so this guy doesn't want to admit that there's any kind of randomness. He wants to believe that there's a God really bad. So he insisted on classifying this thing erroneously to fit his religious conception. So again, I moved that where it looked like it belonged, which was not in Deuterostome, because there's no justification. You can't identify it as a Deuterostome. It has no anus. That's one of the defining characteristics. You know, it has no through gut because there's nowhere for the gut to go through. You know, so
So
he
Aron,
wasn't gonna answer me. So I called a couple of different scientists about this that I know, including you know, Jerry Coyne was very helpful with this. And so I got good expert advice and references to other people that I could talk to. And so I spoke to other paleo people that were specific to that field to make sure that I had full-on justification to remove this, even if this was done by an eminent, you know, professor at Cambridge. I can show that this is wrong. Other scientists need to contest this, and nobody had, because it's just this one team is the only people that ever studied it. So I alerted a half a dozen different paleontologists and said, okay, do I have justification to move this in my cladogram? And they said, well, yeah, you just note why this doesn't belong here, and you can test it, and there it goes. So,
is the Phylogeny Explorer project, is it sounds like you're in consultation with scientists. Would you say that it's fully peer reviewed?
it is not yet, but that is definitely to be the goal. I have already I've already shown it to Darren Naish, as I said, and to a couple of other paleo people. Donald Prothero, for example, is going to be reviewing this, and a couple of others. And there's a number of paleo people that have already shown an interest in it before they even saw it, that are just based on the video series. And the question that I've sent to a number of these eminent paleontologists is that there's a couple of online sources that are actually used by paleontologists. One of them is FossilWorks. And the problem that FossilWorks has is it is functional for scientists. Scientists do use this, but there are some inconsistencies, of course, like there always is in everything. Occasionally, you run up across something that's either in the wrong place, or it's in two places where it should only be in one, of course. And the other thing is that there's a link on there that if you want to see the subfamily, show the classification. But if there's more than like 2 or 3 species in there, it tells you that, or two or three taxa names, then it'll tell you that the classification is too big to show. Well, the purpose of the systematic classification of life is to show the whole tree, and you'll never be able to see the whole tree, but you'll be able to see where you are in it. It's like looking at a world map. If you're looking at a road map to the resolution that you can see the road, you'll never be able to see the whole planet, but you can follow all those roads everywhere you are. So that's kind of where we are in this. And where a number of other taxonomy or a number of other cladograms want to show you just the individual species, and we certainly have that. Ours is more intent on showing you the value of the clades, or the meaning of the clades. Like, what does it mean to be a deuterostome, a nephrozoan, a vertebrate, a mammal, what have you? And so that's what these are all about. So as you go through those various places on the road, there's a little more info boxes at the base of each clade, so that you can open that up and see. Hopefully, eventually, it'll all be filled in with the encyclopedic information, illustrations, and so forth. What I was going for there was a model that was already set up by another website called Paleos.com. And Paleos is a private venture that was done by a handful of autodidacts. But they did such brilliant work. They took stuff that was hidden behind paywalls of the scientific community and set it out in the open on their website. So there are many, many different images that are on Paleos that do not exist anywhere else on the web unless you go through paywall. So it became very useful for scientists, and as well as for teachers and for students, to go be able to look at the same. So we're using that as a model. And indeed, we've actually gotten all of the creators of that website signed on with the Phylogeny Explorer project. So they're now working with us, interested in integrating their site and our site. They focus on geologic time periods, and we're focusing on the meaning of the clades. But we're sharing a lot of their information is being integrated, and of course ours is being integrated with them. There was another website called Arizona Tree of Life Project, which so far is the most ambitious and successful attempts to create the entire taxonomic tree of life as a navigable online encyclopedia. That ran out of funding at about the turn of the century. So this was even before the Human Genome Project had been completed. So there were corrections needing to be made. And while that used to be a peer-reviewed resource, it's not anymore. It hasn't been. So it's 20 years out of date, or 18 years out of date now. And the volume that we have created in the Phylogeny Explorer project has already far surpassed what is in the Arizona Tree of Life project. And we've been relying heavily on FossilWorks, which is already a paleontological resource for much of the backbone of the vertebrate paleontology that we've been entering. And so, because we are able to show this entire volume where you can just see it all at once and navigate it through, we've actually exceeded even that. Wow. So, and this is before we've even released it. So the first impression that I got from Darren Naish yesterday, when he looked at the tree for the first time, his first response was that it was so voluminous that he said, "This is intense." I'm like, yeah.
So this isn't released to the public yet. We can't just go online and kind of sift through it and tunnel into these clades, but it will be soon. Do you have an estimate?
We're estimating to release it in September. I'm really excited about this. I mean, this is something I've always wanted to do my whole life. I've always been interested in systematics and the classification of life forms. And I never expected...
Will it be on a website or in application form?
I just always wanted there to be a complete tree of life. I always wanted to know exactly where everything goes, not just the big groups. I want to know the smaller groups too. Right now, for example, there are a number of different cladograms that you can look up online to see the entire family tree of dogs, of domestic dogs. On our cladogram, domestic dogs are represented by a single node. It's the end node. It's Canis lupus familiaris. And that is in a wash of other canids. So many other canids are visible on the same page that you can barely make out, when you have it highlighted, you can barely make out that one species name. And that one species name represents, what, 200-300 recognized breeds according to the American Kennel Club? But that's only in one, and that's just the end node. So imagine how voluminous everything else is. The biggest problem that I have with the system right now is that it's only useful for scientists, because only scientists understand the words that they need to use as the signposts, and nobody else will. So we're trying to come up with something, an idea that a couple of our people have thought of, called breadcrumbs, which is a way of searching. Now you can put in either the taxonomic name or the colloquial name, and the search feature will take you right to what you're looking for. If you know either name, even if you just know the common name, if you put in the word snake, for example, it'll take you to the area where the port of the clade where snakes begin, all of them. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to get a connecting feature where you have something that will lead you through the tree, like brightening that one line or turning it red or something like that. And the sad thing is I've talked to a number of database engineers, and they say that takes actually a couple of different disciplines that are not closely related to each other. So it would usually take experts in two different fields working together to make this happen. I'm like, this can't be this difficult. But I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't do web design. I don't do database architecture. None of that. So I don't even know. I need other people. And fortunately, we've just signed on a half a dozen programmers to work on this with us. So I'm excited that maybe by September they'll have that feature done. The biggest thing that I want to do right now is the phase 2, where we start making it usable for people, not just scientists, but just people who want to wander through it. So that if you can't tell what any of these Latin names are, you click on the more info box and it'll show you pictures and give descriptions, and you'll at least have an idea, what continent you're on anyway, to use the roadmap analogy, so that you know where to go backward or forward or turn left.
I was gonna say, because you're 25 videos into your series, and that's just taken you from kind of like very simple prokaryotes all the way to mammals.
Yeah,
But you move through it extremely fast, and you're plowing through and tunneling through one clade after another. I can only imagine without that type of guidance, trying to go down different, going down different other rabbit trails, trying to explore and tunnel into different clades would be extremely confusing and daunting to the average layperson. But at least it gives you kind of an idea of just how big and overwhelming this is, how many different species there are, and that they probably couldn't all fit on one boat.
And you remember that the clades that you're talking about, what you've already seen, the 25, most of those episodes are talking about more than one clade at a time.
Yeah.
Like the second episode, I think, was talking about a half a dozen all at once. And because when you're getting into microbes, it's difficult to talk about the individual, persnicketies of each individual microbe and hold anybody's interest. And of course, I want people to understand what they're seeing and hearing. There's another at least couple dozen videos left to do in that series, representing, I think, an average of 2 clades per video, something like that.
Wow.
But yeah, and so that gives you an idea, and that's just linear. So what are we looking at? About 40 some odd different individual videos representing 50, 60 named clades. That's in a linear progression. And remember that the tree of life branches, and every branch produces new branches and new branches and new branches. So the tree of life could be represented more, instead of a tree, it could be, I think, more fairly represented as a tumbleweed.
So you're just covering kind of the clades on our lineage, and then maybe kind of a few distinctions, but you're not covering all of them, right?
I'm just talking about the ones in our direct lineage,
Yeah.
and with a few signposts about what you can see, and over here you see, and over there you see our closest neighbors, and we continue on.
Awesome. Now, I want to, I don't want to talk too much longer before we open it up to patrons, but I do want to kind of touch on abiogenesis. Now, before I get there, I love how in your videos you'll take different traits, like the evolution of gills or the evolution of lungs from, some type of like a buoyancy sac that fish have, and you'll kind of show how one trait can easily lead into gradually turn into additional traits and how we see the different stages of this. But when you go all the way back to the chemical level, and when someone asks you how, Aron, how can life come from non-life? You have people like Kent Hovind that just says it came from a rock. Obviously, that's not accurate, but how can organic molecules turn into living cells, protocells, protobions? Like, how would you sum that up in a minute or two?
Well, it's worse than that, actually. You said organic chemicals, and of course, creationists always ask for inorganic chemicals, not aware that there is a thing called organic chemistry. So the chemicals before they were alive were already organic, and a lot of that already blows people's heads. And the issue is
there's nothing inherently different in terms of, so if something like uranium and something like carbon, they're still made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. It's just a different number.
Yeah,
correct.
Largely, it's a different configuration. And to the thing about rocks, I mean, if we have a bag of two different bags of chemicals, for example, we're just going to compare them. If they might be collections of chemicals, but what makes either one of them a rock? Well, if you want to say in the loosest possible definition that a rock is an assemblage of chemicals, there's one other feature that it has to have to qualify as a rock, and that is that it has to be solid. And no part of biochemistry involves a solid. So
at least not at the temperatures that we're dealing with.
Exactly. So I mean, so at no point did we come from what would actually be technically considered a rock by any extreme. Just because it's a mess of chemicals doesn't make it a rock. So anyway, people want to think that they want to misunderstand this. They don't want to believe it, and the best way not to believe it is not to get it, right? So they have to misrepresent it in their own minds, and they have no idea how. It is very complex. I don't want to mislead anybody about this.
In fairness, though, and I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, and I can see how the confusion might arise when you start to really, when you hear someone talking about the link between the geosphere and the biosphere, and how, in order for, simple lipids to form, they have to be in the presence of some type of minerals. And as life on Earth started to give off oxygen, the oxygen caused the Earth to rust. It caused the iron in the oceans to bond with it and to form iron deposits on the ocean floor. And so you see like these different interactions that life affects the geosphere, and then the minerals themselves are used by life in order to make like calcified bones and shells and whatnot. So like I can kind of see where some of the confusion might come from there. But
somebody asked me a question the other day, a series of questions meant to stump me on every one of them, and every one of these questions were freshman level biology questions. It was embarrassing. These were supposed to stump the experts. Really? I mean, I know your textbook has this in it, but so well, how do you get?
Why are there still monkeys? If
no, it was how do you get a cell wall without DNA? Well, that's a stumping question. We know that the phospholipids are homophobic and hemophilic, so that they're excuse me, not homophobic.
Aquaphobic or hydrophobic.
Yeah, there we go. Hydrophobic and hydrophilic.
So it'd be pretty crazy if you had homophobic lipids.
So they automatically, spontaneously create this phospholipid bilayer, even with nothing in it, right? They just automatically create this on contact with water. This just automatically happens. Yeah. And so the guy's really upset at that answer.
Well, that's because like the hydrophobic is like going to be on the inside, and they form kind of spherical structures, right?
Yep. And so this guy is freaking out. And the next question was, are we supposed to believe that RNA created itself? I'm like, well, yes, actually it does. Even without a catalytic enzyme, it happens automatically on contact with marlinite clay. It just has the features that creates spontaneously RNA oligomers. And so the guy's freaking out again. So then he asked me another basic question, well, it's impossible because DNA can't exist outside the cell. And I said, well, there are microplasms that have DNA and don't have cell walls. So what do you do with that? So, I mean, just every one of these questions, as I said, freshman level biology.
Can I ask you something? What? So, I was just doing an episode for the Here and How podcast on abiogenesis, and it's releasing tomorrow. And so we kind of dive into this, but like, I'm a layman. I'm a science enthusiast. I'm not a chemist or a geologist. I love these topics, and I'm autodidact, but nowhere near to the level that you are, or have I had the number of years of experience in this that you have. But one of the things
That's
when I was
just because
studying,
I'm old. It's
well, and you're very passionate about these topics, and have clearly put the time in to do the research and to study these particular areas. But one of the things that I noticed is, we have various pieces to the puzzle, and so we're starting to get kind of a better picture of how this worked and how it came about. We can see, for example, you look at the Miller-Urey experiment where they recreated kind of an atmosphere, if you will, where they had water that was evaporating and then condensing, and they had a bunch of different chemicals, gases, and added a spark, and they found that these simple elements or these simple molecules formed into amino acids. Now, we've been able to recreate that in various other simulations of like hydrothermal vents and meteor impacts, etc., volcanic eruptions, and all of these simulations have yielded amino acids. What about nucleic acids? Where have we ever seen those come about naturally? Is that one of the missing pieces, or does that also happen in the same process?
Well, that's what I was just telling you about. I mean, the right, oh my gosh, the word escapes me, but the right chemical components mixed with montmorillonite clay actually cause a catalytic reaction that produces RNA oligomers.
Okay, so that's not just the pre-existing nucleotides forming together using the clay to bond together. Like, they're actually, the clay is causing that chemical reaction for the nucleotides themselves to form.
Yeah, and this there was a nice experiment that was done on this where they realized that that when you start with the right components, the right I'm trying to remember. I probably should just have notes in front of me, just because I have these senior moments where I forget the word at once. But you have certain chemicals that you put in this environment, and then you have to change the features of the environment. So you douse them and dry them and heat them. So when you get irradiation and inundation and dehydration, and they notice that when you have a consistent cycle like that, now just imagine these chemicals washing up on the beach. The water fades away, they dry out a little bit, then they get inundated again, and they get irradiated by the sun and so forth. And so when you have this, it's just stirring the pot, kind of literally. And what they noticed was that the chemicals kept getting increasingly complex. So they started with very basic chemicals. If you have to have the right chemical setup, but then as they got they added I want to say a phosphate at like the right moment. They just get it up to a certain level of complexity. They add a phosphate, and boom, ribonucleotides.
Mm.
So yeah, it is so incidental. Now, there are elements of abiogenesis that are way complex and that are still not understood. But the problem is that we understand a whole lot more than people want to believe. They don't want to know. They don't want to know how much we know.
I was surprised. I was surprised to find out that so like when you have a strand of RNA, if it's not surrounded by a soup of other nucleotides, it can actually sometimes fold back on itself and form ribozymes. Yep. And I was surprised to find out that some of these ribozymes, there was an strands RNA, and they found that some of them were actually able to, although kind of poorly, they were able to synthesize new nucleotides. So it's kind of like it suddenly is involved in its own reproduction.
Yep.
And it's a process that can help in its propagation.
So what
and
you have,
proliferation.
What do you have in a sense?
Well, it gets cooler though, because then they found that those strands, after just 10 generations of mutation and replication, got extremely proficient at it. I thought that was really cool.
So in certain lineages of life, and you have to remember that not all life is animals or plants. That's another thing that creationists typically don't understand. The vast majority of life isn't even just bacteria. There are protists that make up way more than plants and animals combined. And people don't understand how microbial life so far exceeds us just in the mass of body weight on this planet. But gosh, what was I about to tell you? I just needed to do that preface to lead into it, and I can't remember what it. Senior moments. I was
talking about how ribozymes were able to create nucleotides.
Yeah, I don't know. I lost it. Oh, yeah, I remember. You were talking about these processes that are being developed, right? Well, it's not just one process. Now, you would think that if there was a creator and wanted to create one mechanism, one means of doing everything, let's like create an original cell and then have that cell proliferate into everything, then they would all have the same process. But in fact, they don't. There are many organisms that where the processes are different, where some aspects of the process don't even exist or are done differently. And these are all incidental. And they've got pathways to show where they can actually chart the mutations leading to different variations of the process. This is at the subcellular structure. I mean, this is the process of protein folding and other things, the way that the cells replicate themselves. And in different lineages, and I mean, largely divergent lineages, these can be remarkably different. And so it's not at all consistent with the idea of that common designer, because why would a designer do anything like this? The only thing that makes sense about it, if you wanted to imagine a common designer creating everything, then the only way to make that make sense is to remember what the Matrix taught us, and a handful of computer programmers and Benoit Mandelbrot also had derived that you can have extreme emergent complexity that is far beyond what human designers can come up with, and the only way that you need to do the way that you need to create this complexity that is beyond human comprehension or creation is by creating a replicative system that works according to very few simple rules. And it will produce everything all by itself. But the idea for people who want to believe in God is they have this reverse perspective. They don't understand emergent complexity because that's bottom up. They want to imagine an authoritarian dictate from the top down. And so they've got everything absolutely, completely backwards.
Man, there's so many topics I want to dive into. Endosymbiosis. I want to talk about Hox genes. I want to talk about I'm starting to realize
Endosymbiosis is a good one. I love that one.
I'm starting to realize I'm about to open this up for our patrons to join in. But there's an hour and a half to cover both abiogenesis, evolution, and phylogeny or phylogenesis is absolutely not enough time. So I'm going to have to get you on again another time. But I'm going to go ahead and open it up real quick. Steve Bauman, thank you so much for the $4.99 super pledge. He wrote, for the pinafence. I'm not sure what a pinafent is. So maybe you'll have to come on and explain that.
Pine tree elephant hybrid. We got this from Kent Hovind.
Okay.
Yeah, because I asked him to give an example of two created kinds that.
Okay, that was from the non sequitur show.
Yep. Yeah. You know what? For whatever reason, Kent will not face me again. I can't imagine why.
Well, it's because you ripped him a new asshole the first time.
Yeah, I've got another such event coming up, but not with him.
Yeah.
Somebody even better.
Well, there's also Godless Iowan. Thank you so much for the $2 super chat. He said, "Holy Koolaid and Aron Ra overloaded by awesome." So thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and open it up now. So if you guys want to join the conversation, I just now pushed publish. So you should see a post on my Patreon if you're a patron, and there's a link to join our chat. Let us know if it's working. Hopefully we'll see you coming in here in just a second. In the meantime, Aron, I wanted to ask you just maybe to explain real quick, what is endosymbiosis and why is it an excellent example of how more complex prokaryotes can come about from simple eukaryotes?
Well, just try to imagine
vice versa. I got that backwards, I think.
Try to imagine your intelligent designer coming up with this. You've got bacteria, something similar to the Rickettsia bacteria, and that is suddenly it engulfed it, or its original intent was to infiltrate and thus destroy larger cells. So it invades, it takes over, and it uses up the resources and then leaves.
Is that kind of like viruses that?
It's like that, but we're talking about a bacteria now.
Okay.
So the Rickettsia, now imagine a Rickettsia bacteria that suffers a mutation wherein the escape mechanism dysfunctions. So the bacteria enters the cell and can't get out. Now, because this particular bacteria generates its own ATP, the surrounding cell is not actually being destroyed by it. Instead, it's enslaved that bacteria to generate energy for it. And now that bacteria actually needs to rely on that, on the survival of that cell for itself to survive.
Well, and vice versa, right? Eventually.
So yeah, so that rickettsia bacteria that's now trapped inside this larger cell is producing energy for the cell and gaining nutrients from the cell, and it has also gotten into a synchronicity with it, so that when the cell divides, the rickettsia bacteria also divides, and it has become mitochondria. So our mitochondria is enslaved bacterial cells
that
now
were
you get
engulfed by, but not digested by another cell.
Well, it's not digested. It's engulfed in another cell. It's trapped in another cell. So then later on, let's see, that same family of cells now with enslaved rickettsia now become mitochondria. Some of those cells may have also enslaved cyanobacteria. Now, cyanobacteria are the ones that are like blue-green algae, and they can absorb sunlight. They do the chloroplast thing. So you know why plants do chloroplast thing just like those bacteria do? Because they've enslaved the bacteria who do it.
So endosymbiosis is it's not just within the animal kingdom that we see examples of it.
Right. It's all eukaryotes. Well, all eukaryotes except the most basal type. The most basal type of eukaryotes, there are some that don't have mitochondria at all, and that leads us to conclude that some of them, or that one lineage of these developed this or enslaved this group, and then you created the vast lineage of eukaryotes from that, and that eukarya is largely based on endosymbiosis. And plantae, the plant kingdom is based also on one of those eukaryotes that didn't just enslave the mitochondria, they also enslaved the chloroplasts, which are the cyanobacteria. What intelligent designer would have a cell that engulfs other cells and then needs to rely on bacterial cells in order to survive? And then the bacteria in your digestive tract, you realize that pound for pound you have more bacteria in your body than you have of your own cells.
Yeah. It's like your microbiome is overwhelmingly not human.
What are you?
So to everyone right now, I think maybe the link that I posted, it wasn't working for some reason, but I've posted one in a comment below it on Patreon, and so that should work. Let me know in the chat if it's not. So
okay. Do we have any other questions?
In the meantime, yes. What are Hox genes?
Imagine, so we want to have something that has a definite beginning or front and back, mouth to the anus, that nephrozoan thing. And now you divide the body into different sections, where you have a tail, or in the case of insects, you have the abdomen, where they don't actually have a true tail. It ends in the anus, and only I can't remember which group finally develops a post-anal tail. So we're going to start with the anal, at the very end. So you divide this body section up, and then color coordinate it so that each section of the body is a different color. And so you're going to have genes that affect only that colored band of that front to back body. And so this is what Hox genes are. And so when they manipulate Hox genes, this is a grotesquely oversimplified description. But what they've found is that when they manipulate Hox genes, which controls a different function, like I said, when you divide your body into a linear pattern from the mouth to the anus, this is the way that you can divide up the genes. Well, they've manipulated these so that when they put them in the wrong places, they develop eyes on the feet of flies, or something similar to that. So, this is the way that the body systems are set up, and it's the same genes that affect the same type functions in the vertebrates as well. So it doesn't matter if you're starting with if the body that's outlined this way is an insect body or it's a vertebrate body, it's the same color coordination, the same banding that leads to this type of production in all animals, which again is another indication of common ancestry and not at all for a common designer. Why the hell would a designer make something like this?
So this is weird. I'm not sure why
if you're having technical difficulties, it's only because I'm here.
Well, so I had my chat last week. It was with, or not last week, last month was with Godless Cranium and Shannon Q, and we had like a ton of people that joined. And for some reason,
that's just because they're popular.
Well, no, they're saying that the link isn't working.
Okay.
And so I'm going to send them, I'm going to copy the exact same link that I sent you and hope for the best. So
I'll take a
it's
look
within Patreon. If you guys go to patreon.com, there's the link, and then someone said that link doesn't work. So with underneath that, I wrote in a comment. But I'm gonna repost real quick. A new one link.
The link that you sent me does work.
Okay. I mean, I'm assuming so because you're here.
Yeah, I'm able to see, no, the link that you sent me for other people to view, and so that there's a chat, I can see people adding to the chat.
Okay.
Use the invite link you get by adding a person, not the URL link. Yeah, you follow that, right? Do you know what Steve McRae put in a note about that? Do you know what he's talking about, right?
Yes, the one at the very top of the Google Hangout.
Yeah,
the one that I sent you.
The one that has a person with a plus.
All right, let me try this one.
When you click on the person with a plus sign, that gives you a shortened link. You want to use that link, not the link in your URL in the address bar.
Okay.
It's exactly the link that you sent me, so you can just copy it out of where you sent it to me.
Okay.
Unless you don't want everybody to be on the call.
Well, no, I'm trying to get everyone in this chat to talk.
Well, yeah, the link you sent me earlier that was to the video and not for participants, that's taken me to where I can see everybody's comments. So I'm gonna look at the comments while you're doing that.
Okay.
But they're all talking to you. This is tech support.
All right.
Fortunately, nobody has said, "Have you tried turning it off and turning it on again?"
I'm writing in a comment below the Patreon post that if the new one, I posted a new link to join. If that one doesn't work, and I'm pasting the one that I sent to you.
Yeah, somebody commented about how funny it was to see me giving technical support. I actually worked for a tech support company I've done tech support for I did about 18 years before I did this.
Yeah. I worked in tech support for a while, but for some reason, Google live chats are always, they always wind up fluking out on me somehow. So, in the meantime, I wanted to ask you, Aron, so you mentioned that there's kind of there is a paywall when it comes to scientific research. If you want to dive into a lot of these papers, a lot of them rest behind a paywall and they're not easily searchable on Google.
Yeah, and the scientific community does itself favors by doing this.
Hey, we got one of our patrons in. Is that Steve?
Yes,
Steve Bauman? Welcome to the chat.
Hey.
So glad to have you. So the new link, it sounds like it is working. It's the most recent one that I posted.
Yep.
Is that the one? Okay. Cool. Aron, I'm gonna ask you one question and then I'll hand it over to Steve and anyone else who wants to join. And if this chat fills up, then we'll cycle the patrons out as they, whoever's been in the longest.
Yeah, we got Surus in here too. So yeah, you're picking up people.
Oh, fantastic.
Yep, there we go.
Also, Travis Bell, thanks for the super chat, the $6.66. It says howdy from Dallas. I hope you're going to be at the Faithless Forum. We're putting on a conference in Dallas on April 7th, and it's going to be me and genetically modified skeptic, godless engineer, Anthony Magnabosco, Prophet of Zod, Caitlin Chloe. I think we've got Ali from Atheist Republic as well now. And
why didn't you ask Aron Ra, who lives here, before you booked that?
Oh, I did. And initially we posted it in the YouTube group and with all of us in it. We're like, who all is able to participate? And then when I invited you and stuff and we were trying to figure it out, then it turned out you had an event at the same time, which I was very disappointed to hear.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I've wanted to do something here in my hometown of Dallas for a long time. And my schedule is surprisingly open for March and April of this year, except that week. So,
well, we'll just have to make sure that we do another one soon.
Yeah.
But real quick, the question that I had for you, Aron, was because there's so much of the scientific research is behind paywalls. Do you think that if all of that became easily available, so like once you publish the Phylogeny Explorer project where people can sift through and literally see like images of every single one of these fossils that we have and of every single, piece of research behind this and have it organized and classified and visible. Do you think that that would be kind of the nail in the coffin to your average kind of run of the mill creationist who says, show me the fossils?
Yeah, I trust that it will, because it refutes all of the creationist counter-evolutionary claims. And like when you say "goo to you" by way of the zoo, this is the way that they try to skip all the intermediates. Like, I imagine a dinosaur turning into a bird, or a fish deciding to grow legs and walk on land. It just doesn't work that way. And when you look at the Phylogeny Explorer, you will see that it doesn't work that way. And it would be impossible for a creationist to look at that tree and then find me. And I've demonstrated this with Kent Hovind. It's impossible to look at that and find a place where you suddenly have a created kind and not a biological relationship, because everything is one of the laws of evolution. And this is another thing that people need to understand, is that because evolution is real, it has to adhere to certain biological laws. And like with every other field of biology, there are laws specific to evolution. And one of those is that the further back in time you look, the simpler and more similar living things appear to be, because they become more and more closely related the further back you go. So when you try to find these transitional species, you find when you get to the basis of two different clades, those things look almost exactly the same. So it's really hard to say, well, when did it turn into something else? Well, that's another fallacy. It never turned into something else.
Wouldn't they just move the goalposts then, though? Like, that's pretty much what's been happening for years.
Well, yeah, that's what they always do. But see, what they have to do is they have to accept more and more. So whereas it used to be that they said that species were immutable, and they told me all through my childhood that evolution is false because nobody's ever seen a new species evolve. And the day that they say, the day there's a new species evolve, well, that's when I'll believe there's evolution. And then I showed these people that speciation has actually been directly observed and documented in laboratory settings dozens of times. And then you're right, they just moved the goalpost. But suddenly it's that they accept speciation and suddenly redefine what macroevolution means, which is completely dishonest. But some of these people have been open enough to tell me that they know that what they believe is not really true, but they're going to continue to believe it anyway.
I mean, at that point, it seems like we would just go from dealing with a lot of really cancerous young Earth creationists to just dealing with a bunch of old Earth creationists, if they were intellectually honest enough to get themselves that far.
Yeah, the big trick that I would, and I'm not talking about just the science right now. One of the things that I would like to promote as an atheist activist is the positive aspects of atheism, being skepticism, and humanism is a good one, and the way that rationalism, the way to think rationally, to understand what is true and what isn't, or what is irrational to believe, and what is illogical. Because these people have to rely on every kind of logical fallacy in order to maintain a belief that, as I said, on some level, many of them know it's not true and don't care. I can't tell you how many times people have told me, these may be what the facts are, but I prefer to believe this, or something along those lines. I have to believe this. Why won't you let me believe what I want to believe? And they tell me this after I've proven something that they believe wrong, and they believe it anyway. They know it's wrong. It's been proven wrong, but they're not going to admit it, and they're going to continue to believe it. Why?
I have 3 questions for you, Aron.
What's that?
First one, are you going to be in Milwaukee on the 4th?
I am.
Okay. So I'm going to play hooky that day. I might come see you.
I'm not speaking that day. That's when I land.
Oh, what day are you speaking?
I'm speaking the next day at the University of Wisconsin.
Okay. Second question, because I'm a dumb rock guy, so I just listen to you guys for my biology. So is a turtle a reptile or not, or is it even relevant?
For the longest time, I wanted to believe that turtles were not reptiles, that turtles were inapsids, and anapsids, that's starting with an A. And I was very disappointed when the conclusive fossil was revealed that kind of cinched it, that that turtles are in fact a subset of diapsids, that they've closed up both of their temporal fenestra. So
Oh,
yeah,
I
so
was
mean,
kind of hoping they weren't too. Oh.
yeah, because I thought it would be cool, but yeah.
And the last question, do you consider Neanderthals a separate species? I mean, I do.
That depends on how you classify species, because our lions and tigers, different species, they can produce hybrids. Sometimes you can produce fertile hybrids, but the trick is, will these species interbreed normally? And what I'm seeing, and this may be a bit controversial, but what I'm seeing about Neanderthals lately, well, actually, I know it's controversial, that Neanderthals were probably a raping group, and that they did not look as human as previously accepted. And I've seen some graphic demonstrations of the positions of the eye holes and everything, so where the orbits are, what the faces would actually look like. And so, yeah, I think probably not as human as people have always believed. So
Yeah.
now, yeah, so I mean, I would technically classify them as not the same species. We know that dogs will hump anything, including your knee. So there's just some animals that are like that. It's not whether you have a sexual attraction to something, whether you're
There's some people I know like that.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah, so I would still consider Neanderthals, even though they interbreed, and even though a substantial number of people have trace amounts of Neanderthal DNA, because it was so long ago. And it's important to remember that there are some people that don't have any, because Neanderthals were not, at least not appreciably, in the African continent. They were all in the Middle East and in Europe. So people that passed through that area were susceptible to, let's call it, integration with some Neanderthals. But the people who had never left Africa were not subject to these encounters, and so their genetics remain, let's say, pure of that.
Okay. But we both came from Heidelbergensis, right? Or
yes, which branched into not just us and Neanderthals, but also two other species, Denisovans, which I think we have only a couple of teeth and a finger bone and some DNA to identify Denisovans. And then there's another one for which we have, ironically, only DNA and no fossil evidence whatsoever.
where'd that come from? I'm unaware of that one.
Yeah, they discovered that when they were doing genetic tests on Melanesians, and they were trying to rate how much Neanderthal DNA they had in Melanesian DNA, and they realized that they found traces of another genome that
Nice.
isn't Homo. I mean, it isn't sapiens, and it's not Neanderthalensis. Now, the big question for one of the things I'd like to clarify is there's a conceptual problem. People tend to talk about Neanderthals and Denisovans so much as humanoids. They were humans. They weren't Homo sapiens humans. They weren't sapiens, but they were humans. I mean, so when they say, well, Neanderthal is human, just like yeah, it's a different species of human, but yeah, they're humans. And maybe some people get confused at this, but I think calling them humanoids actually goes back to a lower group. If you think in traditional Linnaean terms, which I shouldn't. So it would include Australopiths and that sort of thing.
One interesting thing, when I kind of a misconception that I had as a young Earth creationist beforehand was I always thought that there was kind of some point at which one species became another species. But you're always the same species as your parents and your offspring. It's just that it's just like there's not one single day that all of a sudden, poof, you're no longer a child and you're an adult. It's such a gradual process over millions of years.
And as I said, creationists really want to misunderstand this because they don't want to believe it. And if they do understand it, well, then they're going to believe it, and that just throws everything over. The best analogy I can give to really piss off the creationists, because it's too easy to understand, is there's an analogy on the way languages evolve. And this is the best way to illustrate that this is a population level thing. It's not like somebody's wandering around speaking Latin and then suddenly starts speaking French. Doesn't turn into a French speaking person. And it's not like you have a whole bunch of Latin speaking people and then suddenly one guy speaks French and he has to go find a female to speak French to. It doesn't work that way. So we know that French, Spanish, and Romanian, and then by a later generation, Portuguese, all derived from Latin by cladogenesis, which is the way that evolution normally happens. And so if you were to take a group of Spanish-speaking people and set them out on an island some ways, 2,000 years ago, and they're isolated, are those people going to be speaking Latin? They could be. They might not be speaking what we would what any Latin-speaking person would recognize anymore. Would they be speaking French or or Spanish? No. That would be speaking something else, because that's the way evolution works. So that's why you don't see, apes giving birth to people now. So the analogy of the way languages evolve really destroys an awful lot of the creationist tropes. And then you have Italian, which came about by anagenesis, where the difference being, instead of becoming a new branch, it replaced the old one entirely. Now you have to remember that there was not a point where the older generation is speaking Latin and the younger generation are speaking Italian, and they can't properly understand each other. They could always understand each other. But if you had documents, and let's call these fossils, if you pull up a book from a certain age, like between any of these languages, and a friend of mine was studying some old supposedly Spanish literature, and she said it was so old, it was like from the 1500s, that it didn't strike her as being Spanish. And I think she was talking about Don Quixote, but it might have been something else. She said it struck her as this is not quite Spanish, but then neither is it Latin. It's
like reading Old English.
Exactly.
Very difficult to understand.
You can just understand all the words and you can understand the context, but it doesn't make it any easier to read.
Yeah. So I really like the analogy of language because it is very illustrative. And while it's not completely accurate for biology, it does refute a lot of the creationist tropes and eases the ability to understand how this is a population level process. This isn't an individual turning into something else. And it is never turning into something your parents weren't. It's always a Latin-based language. It never turns into a Germanic-based language, which is what creationists want to argue for.
So no pine offense. I'm upset.
No pine offense, yes.
What about crocoducks?
and hybridization isn't the issue either. Again, remember that the creationists have everything backwards. So they start with a number of what they want to imagine created kinds, and they think if you crossbreed those, then you'll get other things. And they think that that's what evolution is. But again, they've got it upside down. It starts out with 1 that becomes 2, then 4, then 8, and so forth. And each one of those is not the same thing. They're all different. And they're all different from each other.
Yeah. Well, and they'll agree on, at the various stages of microevolution, whatever the hell microevolution is. But as soon as you start running into things like ring species and speciation, and then you'll have added complexity through gene duplication.
Microevolution and macroevolution are actually very simple to describe. And these words were invented by evolutionary biologists who set the definitions. So these are our words. Don't let other people misrepresent them. Microevolution is variation within a species. This would be like breeds of dogs or pigeons or what have you, where they can all interbreed. They're all going to be fertile. And you just have to keep them apart if you want to get the purebred that you want. But they're still all interfertile. Macroevolution is where you go to the next level. So like in some stage of microevolution, you're going to have a breed like dachshund, for example. You have a handful of traits within hounds, that there's one particular hound that has these specific traits that distinguish the dachshund from, say, the basset hound, for example, even though they're very similar to each other. But then you go a step further, and these become isolated genetically some way that they no longer interbreed with these. And because of genetic drift, where they keep building up unique mutations that are separate from the parent gene pool, they become less and less interfertile until they no longer produce fertile hybrids, until they can no longer produce hybrids at all. So they don't have any living progeny whatsoever. And
so
then
aren't there variations of this? So you'll have like, a mule that is not able to reproduce, but its parents are, and then don't you have some that are like there's varying stages.
A mule is a hybrid, and we're not talking about hybrids right now.
But then you also have like ring species where you'll have they diverge and they can reproduce with the parent like all the way back to the original around the ring, but they can reproduce with each other.
if you just imagine it on a clock, and at 1 o'clock you have the original species, and 2 o'clock is a subspecies of that, and 3 o'clock is a subspecies of 2, and so forth, and you go all around. By the time you get to 12, the genetic variance is so broad. It's so far. It's not that far distinct from 11, and 11's not that far distinct from 10. But now 12 has become grossly distinct from 1, and so it's no longer able to interbreed with 1. And this is the way genetic drift happens, which is actually one of the dominant. It's not natural selection at all. It's one of the dominant features is actually genetic drift.
Yeah. Well, the arguments seem to constantly change, because I remember, in my creationist textbooks as a kid, the arguments that I was seeing was things like, oh, there are no beneficial mutations. And I don't hear that anymore. It's almost like they're realizing that these arguments aren't working. They're losing these arguments because there are beneficial mutations. Well,
I still hear these arguments. I heard several of them like yesterday.
Really?
Yeah, yesterday.
I don't hear these anymore. Maybe it's just I'm hanging out with the wrong circle, or maybe I'm not.
The thing was that I got into that argument online with Kent Hovind, and that opened the floodgates of idiots that are suddenly commenting on my videos. And it's really great because these people are absolutely clueless. It's like they've never talked to anybody who knows anything before. And so it's nice that they ask me such entry-level questions that I can feel like a super genius being able to answer them. I mean, come on, they're Kent Hovind's followers. They started out disadvantaged. All right, so I'm doing all I can to help these people.
Fair enough. I want to acknowledge real quick, Stephen, and I'm assuming you pronounce it Surus.
Yes.
Okay. Both of them have their own channels as well, on YouTube, and they also talk about a lot of these same types of issues. The religious fundamentalism, what to do about it. They approach it from different angles.
Can I ask each of them to represent themselves for just a moment, explain who they are?
Yeah, to give a quick introduction, and then I also wanted to say hi to Travis as well. I'm not sure your background, but welcome to the chat.
All right, let's start with Travis. Travis, what do you do?
Oh, I just wanted to join and tell Thomas that yes, I will be at the Faithless Forum on the 7th. So
Fantastic.
Whenever I did the super chat, you said, "Are you going to be there?" Yes, I will be there. And Aron, I wish you were there, but
yeah,
sadly, you will not be.
We'll get him next year.
Yeah, I'll definitely be at the next one.
You better.
All right, and Surus?
I'm assuming that was me, but
Did I say it wrong?
the Canadian and then a robot interjected.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, basically, for me, I was a non-denominational Christian for about 23 years, and then in the last 2 years, I've kind of floated very, very extremely far away from it, all the way into anti-theist territory. Mainly because that's what I've already received my first few death threats on my channel from people saying that I shouldn't tackle Islam, and I'm like, Islam's as backwards as anywhere else. I'm going to tackle them too. So
it's because
at the risk, I want to voice something about that as well, because a lot of people think that because I'm an American and I'm in Texas, and so I'm going against the every level of government that's imposing their religious beliefs on me. Islam isn't one of them. Islam isn't my problem right now. I realize Islam is a world problem, and a lot of people want me to speak out more against some of the Islamic beliefs and so forth. And I will attack the Quran once I've read the whole thing. So far I can only attack a couple of chapters, and
that's a chore to get through.
Yeah, I've heard.
I'm
not
only
as
about
long as the Bible.
It's about 4/5 of the size of the New Testament. It's I'm about 6 chapters in myself, but honestly, it's when they say that it was Muhammad dictating, I want to believe them because it sounds about that boring.
It is a very poorly written book.
I know so many Muslims that would be outraged to hear you say that, but I mean, I know so many biblical scholars that had the same reaction. They're like, I thought the Bible was awful.
Although here's the thing, let's be honest, if they've sat through this chat long enough and stayed curious long enough to hear about abiogenesis and evolution and phylogeny, they're probably not the type that are gonna, have made it to this point if they're the type that do death threats.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
pretty much true. The thing that I've noticed with the Quran is that I think there's almost more cherry picking done with it than there is in the Bible. Because, for instance, in the second chapter, they mention that women only receive half an inheritance. But if you've got two women, then they can receive 2/3 of an inheritance split between the two. But Islam also mentions I've seen many fundamentalists in that religion mention that, oh, we're the first ones to give women equal rights. And I'm like, I've read your freaking book. No, you didn't. You're lying. You are freaking lying. It's in your second fucking chapter. It's not hard to find that you're lying through your ass.
I delight in the very few confrontations that I've had with Muslims, but I have had some with some prominent Muslims. One of them was Hamza Sortsis, and he was trying to argue that, and he's the leader of IERA, if that means anything to anybody. But he was
I'm very familiar with Hamza.
I keep seeing him on TV, and it irritates the hell out of me. How does this guy get on TV? And I don't. I realize he's more attractive than I am to look at. I'll grant you that. But I would eat him in equal conversation. So anyway, he argued that the mountains, he argued that isostasy was proof of the Quran, because the Quran said that the mountains were put there to keep the map of the earth from moving. And this is the reason that it says that, is because at that time people thought that the earth was flat, that the mountains were literally paperweights to hold the map of the earth down. And
not to mention they didn't have any concept of continental drift either. That was not even a blip on the radar.
I had to explain to Hamza that the lithosphere flows freely underneath the mountain ranges, and the mountains don't do anything to stop that. And he said, well, any mistake I made is my mistake and is not reflective on the Quran. And I said, no, you said this is what the Quran said. You said this is proof of the Quran. So yeah, this was reflective on the Quran. The Quran is wrong.
That's like, I had one of my friends who came out. He was homosexual, so he came out of his religion because he was homosexual. His family, I don't know if they're fundamentalist Islam, but I know that they're Muslims. I've never inquired very far into it. But sometimes he'll come up to me and he'll ask me, hey, my mom is trying desperately to, convert me back, and she has this passage here, and I don't have an answer for it. What can you do? And I mean, I have to do a lot of research because that's what I do on my channel. So I usually will go into research. And one of the things that she pointed out was apparently in the Quran, it said something about different types of waves in the ocean, and that was somehow proof the Quran was right. And I looked through this, and I'm like, within 10 minutes, I managed to find that not only was that particular discovery about 1,000 years before the Quran was written, that's just as dumb as the fact that whenever they try to say that, oh, well, the Quran was right about how birthing is or how semen is made in the body. I'm like, well, one, no, it's not. Two, we were cutting open bodies and figuring that out 1,000 years before your book was written in the first place. So even if it was right, it wouldn't be stupendous.
Yeah, and that in the Quran says that semen is created in the back of the spine.
Yeah, it says it's created in the back of the spine, and it's just as bad as the Bible saying that the baby is made from the thigh.
Well, and here's the thing though, even if they get one thing right, that doesn't mean that the rest of the book is right. And I don't know how else to put this, but like, I'll have Christians that come up and they'll be like, well, the Bible says, it says in the Bible that you're supposed to wash your hands. Then it took science years to figure that out. I'm like, really? It's that hard to figure out that, you should get dirt and dead flesh and stuff off your hands. And yet, it's like, just because, someone was able to figure this out doesn't mean that everything that they have wrong about the earth, the age of the earth, the shape of the earth, where everything came from, something to be right just because somebody figured out that you should put water on your hands. Like, no, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works.
This wasn't that hard to figure out. As I've said so many times, raccoons figured that out.
not even that. You could always just throw back that, hey, you're right. The Bible does say to use running water, but Jesus said you don't have to wash your hands. So who are you going to believe?
Yeah, and what did Jesus say about why you're not supposed to wash your hands? That's even more damning. Because
diseases come from demons, not germs.
Hey, sir.
Jesus is not the kind of guy you want to get medical advice from. That guy didn't know shit.
What was that?
Hey, Cyrus, will you post a link to your channel as a comment on the Patreon page?
On the Patreon page? Sure, I can do that if that's okay with Koolaid.
I got to bail. I'm late for a hockey game.
I can put his link, him and Steve.
meeting
I can
you,
put their
Travis.
links in the description. Travis, thanks for
All right.
stopping in.
Hey, no
Suris,
problem. I'll see you on the 7th, I guess.
fantastic. That's almost it's 2 weeks from tomorrow. So get your tickets now, guys. They're going fast.
Hey, I'm actually going to see you guys too.
See ya.
Yeah, I was
All
going
right,
to
well,
ask you, Suris. You said you're going to be
Suris,
there as well.
before you go.
I'm going to see you guys as well.
Yeah, Suris, before you go, would you leave a link to your favorite video that you made with Holy Kool-Aid so that I can see it?
Put it in the Google Hangouts chat, and I'll put it in the video description, and Aron can see it in both. He's muted, but I'm assuming that he can hear us.
Okay.
Cool. Well, I told Aron I'd keep him till about 7:30. We got a few more minutes if people want to join in, if anyone else wants to join. Anyone who's a patron at any level, go to holykoolaid.com or patreon.com/holykoolaid. Even just $1 pledge, you'll get to join this conversation. So, yeah.
And on that note, my connection is horrible, so I'm going to go ahead and hop off and free up my spot.
Okay. Did you hear what I asked you?
I don't know if you did.
No, I guess not.
I'll message him. I'll get it
Okay.
to you, Aron.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. While I'm doing that, and while we're waiting for other people to join in the conversation, one common creationist argument for or against evolution is they'll say, like, where are the transitional fossils? Where are your fish with legs? Well, I just found out today from watching your videos that there are not only fish with like fins that are kind of leg-like. We actually have found fish with legs. You want to talk about
several of them? Yeah. Yeah, we still have some walking around today.
They kind of hobble like crocodiles.
Well, there's several different groups, and there's a particular lineage of fish with. They have actually several fish with feet and legs, and we have some now that are independent. They evolved independently, so we have four-legged feeted fish now that are not part of our lineage. But if you go back to the Permian, there are fossils of four-legged proto-tetrapod fish that are clearly part of our lineage. I mean, a fish with a neck, that would be tectonic. That's unusual for a fish.
But there's ones that have even better, because Tiktaalik limbs are more for kind of clawing through like vegetation that might have fallen to like kind of burrow in and escape from predators, right?
Yeah, well, Tiktaalik had the ability to hold itself up for a moment, but it couldn't walk.
Okay.
And neither could Acanthostega, which is actually my favorite transitional species. Acanthostega was an adorable little mud puppy looking thing, about 3 feet long. That it had legs and feet and toes, and it had 8 toes on each foot, and it had gills. It was literally the Darwin fish. You ever see the Darwin fish bumper sticker? This is that animal. However, it wasn't capable of walking around on land. I mean, it could hobble no better than, like, say, a walking catfish could. So its movement on land would be just that awkward, and it's not able to support itself on land any better than a walking catfish has to go from one body of water to another body of water. It can't decide to go camping on the land that night, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Later species like Ichthyostega might have been able to do that. But yeah, there's a whole lot of those. When people tell me that, well, why has there never been any transitional species? I'm like, well, let's look into the vault of hundreds and hundreds of transitional species that you were lied about. But you know what the alarming thing for me is? These people don't care that they've been lied to. I would be outraged if I was told a lie by somebody I trusted. I would be enraged. These people aren't. Why?
Well, there's lots and lots of cognitive dissonance. I've noticed, though, going to, if I visit, like a natural history museum, there are hundreds of fossils on display. Hundreds of transitional fossils. And yet that's only scratching the surface, because most of these places, they'll cycle in and out the ones that are, on display in the exhibits.
Yeah.
And they have entire vaults full of them. So if you come at different times of year, they'll swap in certain ones and swap out others, and they're examining others, they're studying others. There's some that are in labs that scientists are reviewing that aren't even on display. It's amazing just how many fossils we have. even of the ones that we have that we can easily just go to a museum and look at and see, or that we can browse through online, there's thousands of these things.
Yeah, let me tell you a little story real quick. I mean, I used to work with a guy that he was from Somalia, and he was Muslim. And he had, in the trunk of his car, he had all these books about the Quran. He didn't just have the Quran. He had books and books and books about the Quran. So it's essentially, even though he's read all these other books, they're all talking about the same book. So you may as well only have read one book. And so he asked me, what was my problem with the Quran? And I said, well, the Quran is based on the Bible, and that's my first problem with it. Now, mind you, this is like decades ago, and when we had this conversation. So what did I know, way back then? I said, well, one of the problems that I have with the Quran is that it's based on the Bible, and the Bible isn't based on fact at all. It says a lot of things that are wrong. And I said that, he said, like what? And I said, well, one of the things is that, Bible doesn't mention dinosaurs. And I said this only because I wanted to avoid the conversation. I don't want to have this in-depth conversation with this guy. I just didn't want to create, because I'm working with him, and I don't want to create a hostile environment with somebody I work with. He starts laughing in my face because I said the Bible didn't mention dinosaurs. He's doubled over, gleefully laughing at how stupid I am. And we happened to work in a convenience store at that time. So this other person walks in, and here's this guy laughing at me who tells one of the other customers he believes dinosaurs. And he's just laughing. And he got a little confused when the other customer wasn't laughing with him. And so he stopped and he says, do you believe dinosaurs? And the guy said, well, we know they existed. And then the concern turned to alarm, as my Somalian friend now thinks that all Americans believe in what he had always been told were childhood stories. The dinosaurs are just made up in storybooks. And so when I realized that, I said, dude, I can take you to the Natural History Museum downtown right now, and you can see actual dinosaur fossils. I can prove to you they're really, really real. You have been lied to. And there are some people that just embrace the lie. And when you hear something like that, when you realize that you've been fed misinformation all your life, wouldn't you be outraged? You've based important decisions on the information you had. If that information is wrong, then your decisions were wrong, and the person who misled you should be at fault for your mistake. Why are they not outraged?
Yeah. And there's so much waste. I think a lot of people don't understand that concept. There is so much waste, so many lives that, so much time that is wasted, where think of how many people are sitting in madrasas or sitting in, schools, just studying the Quran, memorizing the Quran at young ages, kids who they're not given science textbooks. And I've seen this. I grew up in the Muslim world. I saw it all over the place, where you'd have kids that are literally standing there chanting, rocking back and forth, chanting words in Arabic that most of them don't even understand what they mean. These are kids, very, very young ages. They're doing this for hours and hours and hours. They're memorizing words from a book that's well over 1,000 years old, that's so scientifically inaccurate, that's riddled with errors, it's garbage.
Do you ever take time to appreciate, and I don't mean to make you feel vain or anything, but I mean, seriously, do you ever take time to appreciate the advantage that you have being raised in a multitude of foreign countries over everybody else in this country? Because you realize how insular and sometimes willfully ignorant Americans are. I say this as a natural-born American citizen with a very redneck family. My family is not inclined or will or refuse to go to any Eastern Seaboard country. Eastern Seaboard city of this country, because they consider those places too foreign. So no one in my family would go to New York.
Yeah.
Because they consider it too foreign.
I have to say, while my parents were young Earth creationists, although now I'm starting to I'm not sure exactly how they mesh this, but I'm starting to think that they might believe in evolution now. But they are certainly fundamentalist, literalist Christians. I don't know how they square that circle. But that said, I am extremely grateful that I had the opportunities that I've had so far, and that I was able to be exposed to a lot of this, because it instills in you a certain mindset that you just don't get if you're insulated or if you grow up in the same place. Like when you travel broadens the mind. It gives you a view into other cultures. And I don't know that I would have ever left my faith if I hadn't seen, Hindus practicing one thing and Muslims and Buddhists practicing other things, and how they all came about it pretty much the same way, and how they can't all be right, and yet they're all equally convinced that they are. You start to see those things. You start to see other ideologies and realize that, yours isn't the only one. Which one is right, and how can we figure that out? And I think that's huge and it's extremely, tremendously eye-opening.
Yeah, I think one of the advantages that I had growing up, I was raised in a Mormon family. And when I lived in Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, which are all Mormon dominant, I mean, at that time, everybody was Mormon. If you weren't Mormon, you weren't employed, basically. You had to be good, in good with the people in the church, or you didn't get hired. But then when we moved to Los Angeles, now we're far more integrated. And people would ask me what my religion is. And first of all, I already know there's a problem. If you care what my religion is, if that matters to you, we're going to have an issue already. It doesn't matter what my answer is. But when I tell them that my family is Mormon, right away there's a violent reaction. And they don't even get to the point where they realize, oh, I say my family is Mormon. I didn't say I was Mormon. And right away they interrupt that, even though there's an obvious but coming. They interrupt that to tell me all the crazy things that Mormons believe. Now, Mormons do believe crazy things. But the strange thing is that the other Christians, like the Baptists or whatever, would start telling me crazy things that are even crazier than what Mormons believe. And so I would invite these Baptists into the house and say, hey, you want to come into the house and tell my mother that she believes these things?
One of my favorite examples of that is when Sam Harris mentions how if you said a magical incantation over your pancakes in the morning and believed it'd turn into the body of Elvis Presley, people would think you're nuts. But if you do essentially the same thing with a cracker and a little thing of wine, you're just a Catholic.
Yeah. How the hell is that justified?
Yeah.
I had a huge argument with somebody in my own family today about the issue with my whole issue with religion. What it basically boils down to, it's truth versus lies. Honestly, when religious people, faith, as Peter Boghossian, I think eloquently put it after I did, I have to say, but he did say that faith was pretending to know what you don't know. And that is correct. That these people will, they'll take any factoid, and it doesn't have to be a fact. They'll cite facts that aren't facts, and then use that as absolute proof of whatever they assume. No honest person would take any fact, even if it was a fact, and say that it absolutely proves any conclusion. They're going to say it indicates what it indicates, and precisely what it indicates, and they wouldn't say that it indicates anything more than it indicates. But religious people will take anything they can go, any interpretation of the text, and say that it absolutely proves whatever they already want to believe. And then they pretend to know what they don't know. So you're citing facts that are not facts, claiming knowledge you don't have. These are lies. Not
just twisting and using facts, but also taking the lack of certain facts. They'll be like, well, we don't know this particular whole. It must be God. So it's like, since when does lack of evidence mean all of a sudden that your theory is somehow substantiated? So I can't connect those dots. I told this person that if I just made up a statistic off the top of my head, if I said if 34% of people do this, right? And I just made up that statistic. Hey, you can't prove that statistic is wrong. For all you know, it might be 34% of people that do this. But because I just said it and I've got nothing to base it on, then even if coincidentally it happened to be right, I'd still be lying. So even if there is a God, a Father, the Son, and a Holy Ghost, even if all of those things exist, if you pretend to know things you can't verify at all,
by any means, to any degree, you can't know it. And if you say that I know for a fact there's a God, that's not a fact because it's not objectively verifiable data, and you can't show that you actually know it. You have lied. Even if there is a God, you still lied. And the people I'm talking to are outraged at that, because what that means is that religion at the core is not just logically fallacious, which it absolutely is. Every logical fallacy, you go online and look up a list of logical fallacies. You'll recognize as you go through that list, every one of those logical fallacies has been used as an argument for God. And every argument for God is a logical fallacy. But more than that, it's also lies. Frauds, falsehoods, and fallacies is what faith is.
Yeah. Well, and or a lot of people who mean well but are just completely ignorant as to the evidence, the actual evidence behind it. You know, they'll hear something spewed out, some fraudulent claims by, you know, a creationist organization, and they'll take it and they'll drink that Kool-Aid right up, and they'll just regurgitate it without bothering to check.
The thing that gets me is all the false claims that creationism makes. Now, creationism is a form of religious extremism. My target is religion, but I go for the easiest aspect of it. That's religious extremism, and the most obvious religious extremism is creationism. And the most obvious version of creationism is flat earthism, if you want to if you want to see how that extrapolates.
Yeah.
But the problem that I have with this is that when I correct them on something like, why are there no beneficial mutations or transitional species? I can show them huge lists of both. But the thing I'll never get, ever, is an admission that they were wrong about that. That won't ever happen. And they'll go from me to the next person and they'll say, well, why is there no transitional species? Knowing full well there are hundreds.
This comes down to the fact that their belief isn't based in evidence, and they'll say, oh, I believe this because ... and it's almost never that the reasons that they give. It's more that they've been brought up in a particular belief system. It's emotionally ingrained in them. It's cultural to them, and it's extremely difficult to give up. So even if they say it's based on, oh, well, there's no evidence for evolution, you show them evidence, well, that wasn't the reason that they didn't believe in the first place. It's just the reason that they had told themselves after the fact that their post hoc rationalizations for why they believed that aren't necessarily actually the reasons behind it.
I think it's June, I'm going to be speaking in, I think it's July. I'm going to be speaking in Marshall University, West Virginia, and they want me to talk about creationism. And what I think I'm going to address specifically is this aspect of truth versus lies. Do you want to understand what is really real, or do you want to make up something else and believe that even if it's not true at all? That's because that's the way religion is. They literally do not care what the truth is.
That would be awesome. I would love to check it out. Although we are right now at the end of our time. I promise you a key, and it is now 7:30. Thank you, Aron, so much for taking a chat with me to talk with my patrons. Again, an hour and a half is not nearly enough time to really dive into the depths and the beauty that is abiogenesis, evolution, and phylogeny. I eagerly await the completion of the Phylogeny Explorer project, or at least the publication of what you have so far.
It'll never be complete.
Well, at least the publication to the internet, open access for all of us to dive in and explore it. And go check out, I've put a link to Aron's channel in the description, as well as to his playlist. What is it? The systematic classification of life. Is that correct?
It is.
Systematic classification of life. Fantastic, phenomenal content. Go watch the whole thing, binge watch it. Your mind will be blown. I'm on Steve's channel, and as soon as I end this, and don't forget to check out the Faithless Forum in Dallas, Texas on April 7th. I will be there along with a number of other atheist YouTubers, Prophet of Zod, Telltale Atheist, Godless Engineer, and Caitlin Chloe, Ali, I think Jackson from Atheist Republic, and Anthony Magnabosco. And there may be some people from the Atheist Experience coming up as well. I know several other smaller YouTubers, Brilliant Doubt, Surus, who was in the chat. Steve needs to come, but I don't know that he'll be there. But go watch it or attend it, meet us, hang out. It's going to be a blast. And we'll see you guys in the next video. Don't drink the Kool-Aid.